Okay, so let me just say a couple words about just to respond to some of you with regards to the feasibility of some of what we're talking about, right? So we're talking about certain ideas, certain ways of doing things which are more ethical. And there is some pushback, obviously, because it's like, well, this is all very nice, but it's not possible to do, right? It is not possible to do some of these things that we're talking about because there are so many political obstacles or psychological obstacles, right? So I want to emphasize, right? Philosophy or ethics, right, is always a vision of how the world could be, right? It's not a vision of how the world is. It's a vision of how the world could be. And even if it is not easy to do right now, it is still a vision worth moving towards, right? We are never able in this life, before the coming of Christ, like some of you are saying, to achieve this world, right? We cannot achieve a perfectly equal world or a perfectly ethical world in this life, but we are responsible for journeying towards it, right? For doing the best we can to move in that direction, right? We are called to move in the direction of heaven, right? Just to respond to Kayumba's notion in the chat, right? Of course, we cannot create heaven, right? We cannot make it happen, but we are called as Christians or even Jews or Muslims to work towards it, right? We have to begin the work that God will finish, right? So even if it doesn't seem practical or feasible, we are still responsible for trying to move in that direction the best we can, right? So a lot of what we're talking about, of course, will seem like, oh, this is like a utopia, this is something that we cannot do. So we cannot achieve it, but we must work towards it nevertheless, right? Am I making sense with what I'm saying? Do you see the distinction between making it happen and moving towards it, the responsibility to move towards it? Does that make sense? You can put your hand in the screen if you're following what I'm saying. Okay, so we have a duty as Christians, right, to walk in the direction of the kingdom. We cannot make the kingdom happen, right? But we have a duty to begin the work, right? To keep the ideal alive of ethical way of doing things, being sensitive to the other, dialoguing with the other, and so forth, right? So that's why it's more difficult in an ethics class. It's more difficult to put together ethics with development practitioners because you are in the field, right? And I am already in the kingdom, right? So this is the difficulty, right? But we have the role of ethics, the role of this kind of philosophy is to keep alive the vision towards which we are journeying. If we lose the vision, we will fall into some kind of decrepit, right, despairing, cynical attitude, and we'll get nothing done, right? So one of the goals of this class is not so much to give you the solutions, right? This is not the goal of the ethicist, right? The ethicist is there to give a vision. Do you see the difference, right? So some of you are asking me for solutions. That's not my role, right? I'm not here to give solutions. I'm here to give you the vision and to remind us of the vision of where we need to journey, right? And of course, the solutions this is the creative part of your task, right? How do I step by step, little by little, move towards this vision of a world of equality where everyone is respected with their own concept of well-being, where everyone is listened to as having particular wisdom? It's, of course, you will have multiple obstacles to the vision that I'm presenting, right? Loving and welcoming the stranger is one of the hardest things to do. It's the least pragmatic thing to do, right? So of course, I'm not going to bring heaven to earth, but I want to emphasize we should not be sitting here waiting for heaven. The heaven will come to the extent that we move towards it, right? I have a view of the messianic age or of the kingdom where God and humanity are moving towards each other. If humanity doesn't move, right, it takes longer, right? We are called by God to begin moving towards the kingdom. and to begin walking in the direction of the vision, right? Not to sit and say it's impossible, therefore I will just bend and bow to the principalities and powers that rule the world, right? We are called to resist these principalities and powers. But this is where it becomes interesting. I want to just do this little Bible study, right? When Jesus says we have to resist the principalities and powers, he doesn't say we have to resist directly, right? We are called to resist like the yeast in the bread, underground, subtly, delicately, slowly, gradually, right? So there are ways of resisting which are not which in a way are more efficient because they're not direct resistance. Of course, you cannot stand up to a country like the US and say, we're not going to do what you want. And, no, you have to, but there are still ways of resisting which are more subtle, which are more gradual. And this is what, when you have a clear vision of where you want to go, you can gradually, slowly, like Jesus says in the parables, like the yeast in the dough, hidden, underground, slowly, gradually, or like the mustard seed, small, but eventually slowly grows, right? So there are ways of resisting, right? The principalities and powers and the political powers, there are ways of resisting which don't have to be, which don't require the same political power, right? So that's just one little thing I wanted to say. I'm looking, by the way, at when Europe was under the rule of the Nazis, there was two ways you could resist. You could fight the war, or you could join the resistance, right? So there were two ways you could resist the genocide of the Jews, right? You could go fight the Germans, or you could help save the Jews, right? So to help save the Jews, you don't need much power. You just need a vision. And you can still resist in that way. You see, there are two ways: violent, confrontational, powerful, or subtle, underground, gradual, right? You can either save the Jews, create a route for them to escape, or you can fight with weapons of war, right? And what Jesus is inviting us to do is to fight in the second way, right? Fight gradually, underground, secret, right? And because you have a clear vision of what's right and wrong. We are called to resist, but not to resist with the same type of powerful, violent force. Am I making sense? I think I was responding here to some of you, right, who were saying, well, we cannot resist, right, these political powers. And I would argue that we are called to resist, but of course not with the same we are not called to resist in this forceful way. We can resist in more subtle ways, right? Okay. All right, just had to say that. Now, let's go to the development the African way. Here, so this is the last thing we need to talk about, which is point 4, or yeah, point 4. So the African way. Okay, so here I'm already introducing the work you will do for the post-session. Augustine Schutte, Philosophy for Africa. This is a book you'll be reading. And here, he's actually in South Africa right after apartheid, right? Right after Mandela wins the presidency, the country is, feeling great, elated. And he's thinking, we need to figure out our own path, right? The South Africans need to find their own way to progress and not just imitate the West, right? So, and this is where he says something very interesting, right? He says, so he's looking at the African continent. He's looking at how far the continent has gone in terms of development, right? And he's noticing that materially, the African continent is doing pretty well. There is infrastructure, there is roads, there is hospitals, there is schools, there is money, there is resources, natural resources, human resources. So he's saying we have a lot, right? But why are we still backward? Why is there so much poverty? Why is there so much corruption? Why is there so much criminality, right? So he's noticing these three things are still there, right? Poverty, corruption, criminality. Even though the GDP is doing okay economically, there's resources, there's infrastructure, but he's noticing even though we have the material means to be wealthy, to be developed. What is missing, and why he's saying as a continent we are still backward, is that we have been left with a moral vacuum. So I'm going to write this concept down. Moral vacuum, meaning a moral void, right? He's saying the reason the African continent is still underdeveloped is not for lack of wealth or material resources. It is because there is a moral problem, a moral vacuum. So he analyzes and says this is a moral void, spiritual void, which was left behind by colonization. In other words, the colonists came, right, and they took over the country, took over the culture, right? They pushed aside the culture, they pushed aside the religion, they pushed aside all the African spiritual values, right? And they imposed their own values of self-interest, individuality, and greed, right? We have this. So he's saying when they left, there was nothing left to really nourish the people, right? There was they were left with, the culture was destroyed, the religion was destroyed, there was nothing left to really nourish the soul of the people. There was no criteria left, there was no moral how shall I put it, teachings left, because they had been wiped out by colonization, right? And so his idea is that what we need to do is, in addition, of course, to build ourselves materially, right? We need to recover the lost moral values of the African continent. So that's really his point, right? So there's three things. Make sure you get these three down, right? Number one, he's noticing that that materially Africa is doing well in terms of resources and so forth. He's noticing that, however, Africa remains, right, underdeveloped. So he's like, why? And so he analyzed the diagnosis, right? For him is the moral void or spiritual void left behind, right, by colonization. Okay, so his solution, right, and this is where we'll be reading the book together for the post-session, is we need to recover the lost and forgotten, right, African values. And once we have recovered these values, we will be, as Africans, we will have this spiritual strength and spiritual grounding for truly advancing and progressing as a nation. So he's saying the problem of the Africans is not lack of aid, is not lack of funds, it's not lack of, resources or even education or opportunities. He's saying we are suffering from a spiritual void that we need to heal. We need to go back and find our culture, find our spiritual values, so that we can nourish ourselves, and so that we will then not fall into what is holding us back. He's saying is not material poverty, it's corruption, inequality, criminality. This is what is holding us back. If there was no corruption, imagine where we would be. If there was no criminality, imagine where we would be, right? And if there was no, how should I put it? Yeah, mostly corruption, criminality, and so forth, right? So he's saying what we need to do is to go back to these values if we're truly going to move forward. Okay, are we clear on what I'm saying so far? I'm saying a few things in the chat. Yeah, so obviously, yes. Some of you are reacting to what I said in the beginning earlier, right? So yes, he agrees, right? And we're going to look a little bit at those values, that these values that have been destroyed by colonization are actually powerful values, which, I mean, we don't want to compare, right? And we're trying not to compare the material differences. So let us not compare the spiritual differences either. But the idea, right, is that there are values that have been forgotten and that we need to unbury, right? Powerful values, which, by the way, somebody like Senghor is going to say the West needs to learn, right? Just like African countries we saw yesterday might benefit from learning about the value of self-reliance, right? Likewise, we will see that the European countries, the West, might benefit from learning from African values, right? So he's looking, not, again, he's avoiding the hierarchy, right? Just the values are different doesn't mean they're superior or inferior, but definitely means that the West can be enriched. Western values can be enriched by African values, just like African values can be enriched by Western values, right? So that's the idea here, right? Good. So again, right? Just to respond to some of you in the chat. Even right, what he's saying is that every country, even though if they're not yet wealthy, they have the material resources they need to succeed. What is holding back Africans, he's saying, is not lack of resources, right? Africa is a very resourceful country or continent, right? Not country, right? So he's saying we need to focus our attention on the spiritual side of things. This is new, especially for people working in the field of development, right? Anyone working in NGO is thinking mostly materially, right? We have forgotten to also think about the spiritual aspect of things, right? So that's what he's saying, is that what is truly holding us back is a lack of moral values. And like Yai is saying, lack of good leaders. Why? Because the leaders don't have values, right? They are not connected to, there's a moral vacuum, there's a moral void in the leadership. If there was not such a moral void, there would be much faster progress, right? How? You had a question, I think. Go ahead. Go ahead, How.
Well, I guess, it's kind of 2 points, a little bit like's come out in the chat. For one thing, during the maybe 10 years I've lived in Africa, which is much less than most of you, I feel like Africa is morally superior to Europe in many ways. It's Europe and the US and the West that have lost our morality. So I don't see a link between morality and prosperity. In fact, if anything, it's the other way around. The more immoral we are, the more exploitative we are, the more money we can have. So I think that that link is actually the reverse. I also think that, well, yes, in terms of natural resources, there are significant natural resources in Africa. Some of the barriers to exploiting those resources are things that have not really been mentioned, and maybe in the summary of the discussion didn't come out. Things like infrastructure, like roads, transportation systems, education systems, healthcare. These are all areas where some of these countries have massive gaps, and if those gaps were filled, they could legitimately be power players on the world stage, leveraging their resources. Yeah. But without that infrastructure, it's hard to even move.
Yeah,
I don't feel like it's a lack of morality.
Yeah. I think Gabriel Yai summarizes it very well, right? He's talking about the leadership in Africa, which is failing many of the countries, right? So if there was good leadership, you would have these roads, right? You would have education for everyone. You would have opportunities. You would have a decent relationship with the West, which is not exploitative, right? And so what Shati is noticing, I think what he's looking at is the leadership, right? He's not saying the people of Africa have no spiritual values. That's obviously not true. He's saying the leadership is suffering from a moral void. So thank you for helping me clarify that, right? And so he's saying we need as a community to really reclaim these values which have been destroyed by colonization, right? So he's saying, so he agrees with you to a certain extent that the West in a way has not brought any values, but has taken away values, right? So that's the idea, right? He's saying if we need to we have to stop thinking only in terms of material and realize that there's also a spiritual development that needs to, or a spiritual recovery that needs to happen, especially in positions of leadership, right? Good. So
does that really pass the straight face test? I mean, for me, it fails the straight face test.
Listen, at least we have roads and infrastructure. So we're doing something right. Right. I mean, obviously we can compare, but you know, what I'm not trying to say, right, that Europe is morally superior to Africa. What I'm saying, Shati is not talking about Europe. He's saying in the African continent we have been robbed of our values, and we need to recover those if we're going to truly move forward. That's all he's saying, right? And that's all also I'm saying. When it comes to the Europe and American continent, you have to give them the fact that there are values. I think the key to our success, yes, to a certain degree, there's been exploitation and so forth, but a lot of the success of Western countries is built on certain values. We are not completely void of values. We cannot say that, right? It's different values. And of course, there's a dark side, right, to the success of Europe and so forth. But he's not focusing on that, right? He's simply looking at the African continent and saying, we need to recover. He's not comparing, right? He's saying simply, we need to recover our values if we're to move forward. And he is, and unlike, I think he would disagree with you on that, how is that for him, true progress, including economic progress, cannot happen without these values. You need certain amount of values, moral depth, in order to achieve true progress, including material progress for everyone in a given country, right? So I don't want to go in a discussion of comparing apples and oranges, but he's simply talking on the level of the continent, right? Manze and then Kayumba, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this class is really trying to teach us how the world behaves. And we cannot defend whatever we see is wrong. There's no way we have to compare the Western governments with the African governments. There's no way. We have a big problem here in Africa. At least if there's a leader in one of the Western countries who is not good, like the way people talk about Putin being in power for a long time, Angela Merkel and all that. These leaders who are there, they are there for purpose. They are serving their people honestly. People have employment, people have good medical care, children are in school, there's no war. And you cannot compare such kind of countries with Africa. It is true that what we are studying in this course is actually telling us what is in Africa and what is in the West. For me, it is true that Africa needs some work. As you put it earlier, this ethic is about what is supposed to be done. And that is what we are talking about. And we should not try to defend what we see is wrong, and we try to put it in the right place. There's no way African leaders should be compared with the Western leaders. That is true. Because what we have here is complete disaster. And if these leaders could be changed in whatever way, they should change so that we can achieve what we are learning here. Otherwise, Africa will remain the way it is, and it will be a subject of discussion for maybe centuries to come. Thank you.
Nicely put, Manze. Thank you. Let's add Kayumba and then Apente.
Yeah, thank you so much. Actually, yes, Mandela at some point was wrong because for me, in my opinion, I don't see any problem in the morals, values of Africans. Because even before, if you can read the history, you can see how powerful African values was, and still now. But the only problem I can see, on my opinion, is that one of the big challenge Africa has, it has the resources the Western needs. So because of that resources, the Western have to make sure that they put leaders, they are the one who decide on the leadership of Africa. If they don't want you, if you are doing best thing to your people, they have to make sure you are no longer there. For example, Gaddafi. When they remove Gaddafi from power, they said they are bringing nice thing to the Libyan people. But today you can see what is in Libya, it's just worse. So here in Africa, the problem we have is that we don't decide on our leadership. People with ideas don't have power. That is the problem here in Africa. And people with power, they don't have ideas, which means those Western people or those people who put them on power, they keep controlling them. So every agenda we are following is from those people who want resources of Africa. Actually, the only problem we have is that Africa, we have resources and we don't have power to fight for those resources, to keep it. So lastly, I think we were lucky to have resources. Then it blinds us that those Western countries, because they became clever, then they just come and manipulate everything. So another challenge, if you can remember the story in the Bible of Babylon, when Nebuchadnezzar go in Israel and take all the good brains in Babylon, Daniel and the other people. This is what Western do. They make sure they take best brain in Africa and they take them there. So if they take good brains, if you drain all the good brains, so it means that you remain with nothing. That is why we have resources, but we can't do nothing with it, because all good brains, the Western people, they make sure they take it. They are working for them. Some of them, they work for NASA. Others, they're big researchers in those big countries, because of so they can afford to pay them. But also they educated them. So I make this point why I don't agree. Mandela was wrong on that point. African people, they don't have any problem in terms of values or morals. As always said, the more you become immoral, the more you can make more money. This is what the Western do. They just come with big weapons, with NATO, with everything. Then they make a reserve of petrol with essence. Then they take African leaders to the court in that international court. You see, that is that is what I think.
Okay, Kayumba, thank you for this very bleak picture. Let's hear if anyone wants to respond. Apenteng, would you like to add? You're muted, Apenteng.
Sorry, so I was just reflecting on everything you're just saying, and so according to Augustine, from what you're saying, he believes that we are underdeveloped not because we lack resources, but then because we there's this moral or spiritual void, right, due to colonization. I sort of see it as does blame being put on colonization. The first question that comes to mind is, why is that so? Because I also believe that with or without colonization, people are naturally or inherently likely to lose their moral values. So I don't know, maybe this is something the class can help me with. I was just thinking, like, did they have to lose it, or why should colonization necessarily be blamed? Yes, I understand that's his point, but I'm also just thinking that why should he blame it on colonization when, with or without it, inherently people could lose their moral values and decide to misbehave. So that is just what.
So we need that. I'm seeing that we need to go a little deeper into what he means by those values. That way we can see more clearly, right? So let's be very clear, right? He's not saying that the African continent has no values, right? I'm clarifying for some of you. He's saying those values have been lost, right, to a certain degree because of colonization. So let's look. I want to summarize a little bit these values, and then I'll get a couple more questions because I'm running out of power. So we mentioned this already. He's going to focus on the concept of Ubuntu, which I mentioned before, right? A person is a person through other persons, right? So he's basically, right, I think I mentioned this already. He has this is a complete shift, right? With the concept of what it means to be a self, right? In the West, to be a self, you can be completely yourself without ever looking at anybody, right? You can achieve you can get a career, you can blossom as a self, you can become very powerful, you can become very successful without needing any type of connection, right? This is the individualistic, self-reliant self of the West, right? So we have two concepts of the self, right? You have the Western self, which is entirely self-reliant, right? Meaning that it builds itself without any type of connection. It doesn't need relationship to become fully itself. And then he's going to introduce the African self, right? Which for him is entirely interdependent. And he's going to say, this is the value that we have forgotten, right? This is the notion that we become fully ourselves through our connections, right? In other words, we are, whether we like it or not, we are interconnected. This is the key thought, right? Let me write this down. Whether we like it or not, we are interconnected, right? We influence each other, we affect each other. So he gets this notion from this, this idea that, actually, let me not get into too much technicalities, but that's the idea. And so if I'm not doing well, I mean, rather, if you are not doing well, therefore I'm not doing well, right? We talked about this earlier. And so he's saying that were the African continent to recover these values of thinking that my well-being also is connected to your well-being, we would go beyond this kind of mentality of, I'm going to take all the wealth for myself and neglect, right, the rest of the country. A lot of the issue, right, with the African leaders that we've been talking about is this idea that is the corruption. I'm going to get as rich as I can. It doesn't matter what happens to you all, or my family and me are going to get as rich as we can. There is a loss of this notion that I cannot be truly rich unless the whole country is rich, right? I cannot be truly safe unless the whole country is safe. I cannot be truly prosperous unless the whole country is prosperous. So the idea here that Shati is presenting, Augustine Shati, is we need to recover this interconnectedness that we used to have as Africans before colonization. This was how we used to think, right? We would never think as individuals getting rich in a corner where everybody else is suffering, right? We would never think like that before. We learned this, he says, from the West, right? And so that's what he's suggesting. And of course, when you read the book, right, by Shati, you will have a lot more details, right, about that. Any questions about this so far? Or last comment, because we're coming to an end. Okay, y'all are tired, y'all want to go, I get it. Okay. Okay, great. All right, so we'll go more deeply in the post session on the African values. You'll get a full range of what he's talking about, but this was I wanted to add that, right, in terms of, you know, true development incorporates also the spiritual and the moral aspect. It has to incorporate that and not just be thought in terms of material development, right? Kayumba, would you like to close us off?
I don't want to close. I just want to make a point. So this philosophy of Africans before of interdependence, it was good, but still, Stephen R. Covey once said that interdependence choice is for independent people. So for now, because of that colonization, it's very hard for even for Africans to make that choice of interdependence, because you have to be independent before you go for interdependence.
Good, yeah, I like that.
That is why I think we are always left behind. You have to be independent or self-reliant before you go in that interdependence relationship. If you're not independent, you can't go for interdependence relationship.
Excellent.
Because that is only the choice for the independent people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is the only comment I had. Thank you.
No, excellent. You bring it all together, right? In a way, the values of self-reliance are good if they're connected to the values of interdependence, right? That's what you're saying. So in a way, we need to nurture also the values of self-reliance, but in order to be better connected with each other. And then when we have the balance, right, between self-reliance and interdependence, this is when the moral vacuum will be filled, right? I think you would agree with you, right? When you read the book, you will see that this is the case. Okay. So remember, thank you all for such a lively discussion. I love it. We philosophers love to debate and to be challenged. So it was really so interesting for you to speak so freely. And I'm always learning, right? It's always a pleasure to hear different perspectives. So remember, you have your little journal assignment to put in the Google Drive. Anybody have problems with handing in the assignment? It was okay? Okay, so you have today a new journal, same thing. You will be writing the moments in the class that really inspired you, not the summary, just certain moments, ideas which you are taking with you for either your work or your own private relationships. It's okay. And then tomorrow we will go into conflict resolution. And we will go into culture. I think we'll be talking about the problem of culture. Now we are going into the 3 main topics: culture, environment, gender. These are the big hotspots of development. Shumko, you have a question? Go ahead.
What if the journal, what are the consequences if the journal is less than a page?
It depends what you say in the journal. If it's interesting, try to be interesting. If it's interesting, it might be okay. I have to look. To be honest, this afternoon, I'll have to look and see how you guys are doing, and then I'll give you feedback. Yes, so I'm not sure. But again, don't work on it more than 1 hour. It shouldn't take longer than 1 hour, right? So if you come up with less than a page after an hour's work, I guess that would be okay, right?
Yeah, that's what happened to me.
Okay, no. You stop after an hour. Don't make this a big deal. Yeah, good. Any other questions? Okay, great. All right, I'm gonna stay behind for whoever wants to chat a little bit until like around 2. So I have about 10, 15 minutes. The rest of you can go, have a rest. I think Cole has already left us. Cole has fallen asleep. You're still here. Well done, Cole. I'm proud of you. Go to bed, Cole. All right. The rest of you can go. Whoever wants to stay can stay. Did I stop the recording? No, I have to stop it now.